One man's hawk is another man's dove. One man's hug is another man's shove. One man's rock is another man's sand, and one man's fist is another man's hand. One man's tool is another man's toy. One man's grief is another man's joy. One man's squawk is another man's song. One man's crutch is another man's wing. One man's pride is another man's humble. One man's step is another man's stumble. One man's pleasure is another man's pain, and one man's loss is another man's gain. One man's can is another man's grail. One man's anchor is another man's sail. One man's right is another man's wrong, and one man's curse is another man's song. For every father's daughter, for every mother's son, the only thing the same is that it ain't for anyone. Hank Williams said it best, he said it a long time ago. Unless you have made no mistakes in your life, be careful of stones that you throw. One man's juice is another man's ace. One man's back is another man's face. One man's reason is another man's rhyme, and one man's dollar is another man's dime. One man's tree is another man's post. One man's angel is another man's ghost. One man's rain is another man's drought, and one man's hope is another man's doubt. One man's faults is another man's fear. One man's toupee is another man's hair. One man's hand is another man's stub, and one man's feast is another man's drug. One man's dread is another man's dream. One man's sigh is another man's scream. One man's water is another man's wine, and one man's daughter leaves another man crying. For every father's daughter, for every mother's son, the only thing the same is that it ain't for anyone. Hank Williams said it best, he said it a long time ago. Unless you have made no mistakes in your life, be careful of stones that you throw. One man's famine is another man's feast. One man's pet is another man's beast. One man's bat is another man's ball. One man's art is another man's scrawl. One man's friend is another man's foe, and one man's Joseph is another man's Joe. One man's hammer is another man's nail, and one man's freedom is another man's jail. One man's road is another man's rut. One man's if is another man's butt. One man's treasure is another man's trash. One man's landing is another man's crash. One man's word is another man's lie. One man's dirt is another man's sky. One man's skin is another man's colour, and one man's killer is another man's brother. For every father's daughter, for every mother's son, the only thing the same is that it ain't for anyone. Hank Williams said it best, he said it a long time ago. Unless you have made no mistakes in your life, be careful of stones that you throw. Hank Williams said it best, he said it a long time ago. Unless you have made no mistakes in your life, be careful of stones that you throw. And amen to that. There's room for every opinion.